Figalda was sent in advance as far as Gumbenen on the road to Königsberg. It was not without some difficulty that we climbed the almost perpendicular slope which one must surmount on leaving Kovno for Mariampol. We were forced to get out and walk. As the horses were falling or losing their foothold at every moment, the carriage was several times on the point of running backward and tumbling over the precipice. We heaved at the wheels and at last reached Mariampol. I held a consultation with the master of the posting horse, an honest fellow full of zeal and good feeling. He assured me that the roads were passable and that if we gave him 2 hours' start, he would undertake to arrange relays of horses for us as far as Warsaw, going by Augustovo. The desire to meet his dispatches from France en route made the emperor incline a little towards the road by Königsberg, but he left the final choice to me. I did not hesitate. I sent instructions to Falgada to rejoin us at Posen. I sent a postmaster along the road to Warsaw with instructions to order horses in my name as far forward as Pultusk, where he was to wait for us. He had seen the emperor before and so recognized him when we first arrived. He promised me, however, not to mention his name, and he kept his word. The emperor spoke to him, which delighted him. We set out an hour behind him and found peasants' horses everywhere, but as our carriage was on wheels and there was no time to fit runners on it, we were unable to get through the snow, which was piled up everywhere to a considerable height. The courier's sleigh, on the other hand, flew over the surface. Chance led me to discover a covered sledge at the first relay station. This was a piece of good fortune in view of the emperor's impatience to reach his journey's end. The gentleman who owned the sledge was glad to let me have it for a few gold pieces. The emperor and I took our places in it. We left the carriage in charge of the footman, who had gallantly stuck by it, seated on the flunkey's step. The emperor hardly gave us time to transfer our rugs and arms for lack of space in the sledge. He was even forced to abandon the toilet equipment, which was so useful to him. The seats were uncomfortable. We were poorly supported against the jolts of the road, and the air was close. The emperor, for the sake of arriving sooner, had sacrificed everything, which makes a long journey endurable. Henceforward, we traveled much more easily. We even made time. The Grand Marshal, who had again caught up with us at Mariampol, now fell behind us the first mile we covered beyond the town. Therefore, we never saw again either a carriage or a man of all that had left Smorgoni with the emperor. The emperor had become very cheerful as soon as we entered the duchy, and had been talking incessantly about the army and about Paris. He had no doubt that the army would remain at Vilna, and did not in the least recognize the extent of his losses. Vilna is well stocked with food, and will put everything to rights again, he said to me. There are supplies that it will take to stop the enemy. The Russians will be at least as tired as we are, and suffer just as much from the cold. They are certain to go into cantonments. Nothing will be seen of them but Cossacks. The orders and recommendations I left with Monsieur Bassonneau will anticipate everything that could come up. Marais is confident of Schwarzenberg's sense of honor, and he says that he will hold his position and defend the duchy. Monsieur Bassonneau has written to him, as well as to Vienna and Berlin. The emperor was anxious only about the effect that our reverses had had upon those two courts. He felt, though, that his return to Paris would restore his political ascendancy. Our disasters, he said, will make a great sensation in France, but my arrival will counterbalance their bad effects. He planned to take advantage of his passage through Warsaw to bring the Poles to life. If they really want to be a nation, they'll rise in a body against their enemies, he added, and if they do, I shall take up arms to defend them. Later on, I should be able to grant Austria those concessions she has so much at heart. Then we could proclaim the re-establishment of Poland. Austria has a greater interest in that than I have because she lies nearer to the Colossus of Russia. If the Poles don't do as they should, that will simplify things for France and for everyone else. For peace with Russia will then be easy. He chose to believe or at least tried to make me think so, that all the cabinets of Europe, even those most wounded in pride by the power of France, were anxious that the Cossacks should not be allowed to cross the Niemen. The Russians should be viewed by everyone as a scourge, he said further. The war against Russia is a war which wholly in the interests, if those interests are rightly judged, of old Europe and of civilization. The Austrian Emperor and Monsieur Metternich realize this so well that they have often said as much to me at Dresden. Emperor Francis understands perfectly the weak and shifty character of Tsar Alexander and mistrusts him, having already been deceived by his protestations and tricked by his promises. The Viennese government understands perfectly that apart from Russian contact with Austria over a long frontier and all the divergent interests arising from such a situation, Russia's designs upon Turkey make her doubly dangerous. The reverses that France has just suffered will put an end to all jealousies and quiet all the anxieties that may have sprung from her power or influence. Europe should think only of one enemy, and that enemy is the Russian Colossus. I answered the Emperor frankly. As a matter of fact, it is your Majesty they fear. It is your Majesty who is the cause of everyone's anxiety and prevents them from seeing other dangers. The governments are afraid there is going to be a world state. Your dynasty is already spreading everywhere, and the other dynasties are afraid they will see it established in their own countries. Even now, all the German interests are being hurt by the system of taxation adopted 3 years ago, and the political inquisition set up by certain tactless representatives offends national opinion, wounds everyone's self-respect, and runs counter to all their habits of thought. All these causes and considerations, which are perhaps partly hidden from your Majesty, make their hatred of you a national force. And what has stirred up the people even more than it has the governments is the military regime imposed upon Germany under the administration of the Prince of Eckmühl. The Emperor was so far from checking my frankness that he listened and replied not only without anger, but with sly good humor. From the way in which he received and discussed several of my remarks, one would have thought they did not touch him at any point. He smiled at the things which came closest to him and kept up the air of taking them in good part and of wishing to encourage me to say all I had on my mind. All the things which doubtless seemed to him rather strongly expressed, he tried to tweak my ear, but he could not find it under my fur cap, and so my neck or my cheek received a pinch, a kindly rather than an irritable one. He was in such a good mood that he admitted the truth of some of the points I brought forward, others he refuted. Concerning still others, he remarked that particular interests might here and there have been disturbed by police measures or by combinations of circumstances which had nothing to do with the end he had in view. The people, however, were too enlightened, he said, not to see from the very administrative system of the countries he had merged together that our laws under which they now lived offered real guarantees to every citizen against all arbitrary action. He insisted that our administration was based upon principles that were broadly conceived, noble, adapted to the ideas of the century, and suited to the real needs of the people. He went on to say, I could treat them like conquered countries, but I administer them like departments of France. It is wrong of them to complain. It is the checks on trade that irk them, but those depend on considerations of a higher order, to which the interests of France must also yield. Only peace with England can end those inconveniences and their complaints. They need only be patient. 2 years, a persevering effort will bring about the fall of the English government. England will be forced to conclude a peace consistent with the commercial rights of all nations. Then they will forget the inconveniences they complain of, while the consequent prosperity and the state of affairs that will then be established will for the most part provide means for the prompt repair of all their losses. The emperor complained that in these days everyone obstinately refused to look beyond the little circle of his own difficulties. Even the most capable men held to this narrow range of vision, whereas it needed no more than a little goodwill to realize all the advantage they were on the point of enjoying as a result of a larger view. All the sacrifices had been made. It needed only patience to gather in the harvest. It was not given to everybody to judge the new road he had pointed out. The system he had been forced to adopt against England could be judged, together with everything that followed from it, only after the passage of some years. It ran counter to too many habits and damaged too many petty interests not to stir up discontent in a lot of people. And it was of these malcontents that the forces of stupidity and blind hate were now taking advantage.